At times like these, I'm reminded that the neurosurgeon screaming for more, a paranoid's poison door, Ian Wattenmaker, who turned me on to King Crimson when I was 9, had asked me if his father could put me under hypnosis. His father was an Attica State Prison psychiatrist living next door to me in Pittsburgh. I said maybe. And when the letters began coming, I was often so traumatized I would fall asleep reading them. The thought of my duty in writing this is heavy-lidded, in the sense that I feel like I'm falling asleep despite the magnitude of the problem. Will Zell, who also figures in my corpus, had a treehouse in which an 8-track would play the song I'm Only Sleeping over and over again. What I want to discuss is Václav Havel's. Perhaps you know who he was. He was the man most responsible for the Soviet Union deciding to dismantle. He led the Velvet Revolution and convinced the Russians to leave Czech Republic from his prison cell, where they were holding him for reasons that were related to self-expression and things that are considered givens, at least used to be considered givens in the West. And in 1995, he delivered a Harvard address. And there's some things I found in revisiting this Harvard address after all these years. It's in The Art of the Impossible, that I found worth noting because they don't really make a lot of sense in light of what we know about these arguments weighing in favor of conflict between the East and the West that's going on today. He begins the essay by talking about a cafe in Singapore where the seating arrangements, the music playing, the atmosphere, and the politics in the newspapers were all identical to the cafe he frequented in Prague. And it caused him to reflect, as he had many times, that we'd become one world, largely by media. And the direction of his essay from there is how precarious the situation could be, but the trajectory of the media that had certain ideas formed in Fayoum in the turn of the 20th century. This was where Griffith met with Mussolini, and the thinkers were known as Italian futurists, who were allies of Britain during the war. In other words, the anticipation of global control by conquest of media is now an achievement known as the unipolar moment. Havel opens his description of the continuity in global media between Singapore and Czech, and of course he's talking in Boston. As being part also of the interconnectivity of the banking system. He talks about how dishonesty in one corner of the world can have ripple effects all the way across the globe. How do we credit Václav Havel's entire address, however? And that what he goes on to do, remember that he was an ally of George Bush. It's a peculiar thing for an ally of George Bush to be doing. He goes on to make a stand for the multipolar world, for the need of recognition of different cultures. It's the identical argument that Alexander Dugin makes, that the Bush regime has produced such blowback against that war broke out in the Ukraine on these battle lines. So how do you make sense of this? He was, after all, the person who brought about the end of the Soviet Union. Here he is saying, in advance of the friction between Russia and Ukraine, that Russia was right, that we do need to reorient towards a multipolar world. So this seems to me a very relevant arrangement of issues in his Harvard address. Now, was he simply whistling in the dark is a serious question. Did he simply anticipate that his words would fall on deaf ears? Nobody, after all, that I know of is addressing this problem in his organization of thought as an ally of Bush, a rather strange thing for an ally of Bush to do. You would have to be Columbo to sort it out. But since his opening says specifically that it was otherwise, that he did expect people to rise to the occasion and understand what he was saying. It was, after all, Harvard. Maybe he did expect some response, and not just the echo and lifeless echo of agreement that Robert Frost describes in his poem, The Most of It. So what does he do? It can be found in the book, In the Art of Impossible, as we know that he doesn't reveal all that he knows. This is shown by the fact that it was 1995 and Rosa arrived at CCAC in 1992. So she was partly named for his hometown of Rosine. Her name was Rosine. And she was part of the Velvet Revolution's cover-up for what Zell was doing on Mount Desert Island. So he clearly didn't mention Gail Burston. He kept silent about her. And throughout the book, The Art of the Impossible, he shows characteristic tender feelings that are characteristic of Europe's leadership towards the extravagance of Israel. So you can make a case for the multipolar world. That's clear. That involves recognition of tolerance and freedom of speech. And I don't think Russia is afraid of those issues in the way that we proclaim. But it's a strange thing to be doing at that time as an ally of Bush and, I might add, Martin Scorsese, who co-produced with Peter Gabriel and Václav Havel the episode with Rosine. So was it a sort of overshadowing by diplomatic ruse which might happen to be the only, which does happen to be the only dimension that so-called alternative media allows. The sandbaggers do not allow discussion of Gail Burstyn. Noam Chomsky was advised about Gail Burstyn in the 1990s. George Galloway has had 2 years to respond to questions about Gail Burstyn. But they only allow the division between unipolar and multipolar. And Vaclav Havel says both things simultaneously. What's going on? Could it be that Alexander Dugin and Havel shared consciousness of Gail Burstyn and sympathies about her, and that they're discreetly hiding this fact under the diversion of this central dilemma between the unipolar world and the multipolar world? If so, what did they expect of me? Surely they didn't expect me to pretend I wasn't there and I didn't witness the whole thing. And after all, it was Russia who tipped me off to Ouspensky when Kamila Valieva fell for 4th place in the Beijing 2020 Olympics. So has this been a limited hangout all along, with the intention ultimately of bringing to light Lenin's Houdini? Because you can be sure that it's a very straightforward situation with respect to Gail Burstyn. She signifies the reality that Lenin was in on it and pulled a Houdini. Now, their objections by the way they've staged the guerrilla theater are quite straightforward. They're duplicitous and deceptive, but they're also very straightforward. The Lady Panther, who, under the flag of Dixon, who seduced me at Pitt News, was married. So the fundamentalists, led by Obama, were announcing the cause of respect for the institution of marriage. What you would expect it to be discussed, that she didn't tell me she was married. She misrepresented it as a roommate. In fact, I thought she meant another girl. But it was her bedroom. All the women that they complained about had me in their bedroom. It was their control situation, not mine. There used to be a saying by George Wallace, a notorious bigot. Send them a message, and everybody knew what that meant. Meant do something terrible to scare them, symbolically and through imagery. They do this through Clint Eastwood Studios with the help of Ringo Starr to me here in Tacoma constantly. Nobody ever takes my side. They would have to acknowledge and admit that Gail Burstyn should be the object of their investigation, not me. And they refuse to do that. And one of the things that's very interesting about this quandary, what do they expect me to say about any of this, is that recently Chile elected a right-wing former, his father was formerly a member of the Nazi named Kast, with a K. And we know that Peter Gabriel's organization is the caste of hair. And what this suggests is that there's a derisive underground of lewd fascist intelligence emanating from the eminences of the former Beatles. And this is what makes the paradox of advocating for the people who started AIDS and who they claim killed him so seductive that Seattle's political people would go along with it on the intelligence that they have at casino winnings that they can pull off, if they force me to conform to what their cut and paste studios call total recall. In other words, they want me to say exactly what they expect from a human parrot. They want me to follow Wanamaker's auto-hypnosis and repeat after them or be accused of stealing a car in which I was kidnapped and held hostage. That's the way Richard Starkey's mind operates. Throughout this whole thing, his mind is operated in defense of and advocacy for Gail Burston. And Havel must have known that at the time. So his simultaneous embrace of the unipolar moment and the multipolar dimension of the future was nothing more than a diversion to sweep his awareness of Gail Burston under the carpet.